Hello, I'm Adinsur. Welcome back for some more Holy Pally discussion. This is the final iteration of this spec in Legion, and dare I say it's even stronger and more versatile, which is more important, than before. If you've played through Legion, you might have noticed that every single patch Holy has gotten more and more choices in terms of talent distribution. Now we are at the point where this talent tree is possibly a true representation of the entire talent system which was designed back in Mists of Pandaria. And basically it's designed to give you viable choices in all tiers and give you the opportunity to play as you wish. However, for those of us who like to min-max, I have to divide all the possible builds into two categories. The usual Legion build and the Antorus build. Before that though, let's go through the changes besides our talents that happened in this patch. And if you were hoping for a more robust guide going through all the spells and tips for the Holy Paladin class, check out my previous video on this topic and then come back for these updates. Number 1, when going into Antorus as a Holy Paladin, a really good sign is that not a single boss hinders your gameplay in any way. And what I mean by that is whichever way you play your Holy Pally, there is no point in time while fighting these bosses that you feel useless as a healer. What's more, it seems as though fights cater to our playstyle in many ways. That of course means no frustration for us and an opportunity to basically crush the meters on most bosses. As for the tier set bonuses, well, they aren't anything to write home about, at first glance at least. The 4 set is really random and doesn't contribute much to our gameplay if you don't build strictly around it, but more on that later. So, the priority when gearing isn't necessarily to immediately swap your tier 20 for tier 21, and there are two factors when considering this. First is how much of an upgrade in terms of item level it is. If it's 15 plus item levels, I would say it's worth switching as long as you don't lose a lot of crit for it. And of course crit is the second factor. If you have above 50% crit after the switch, so with the tier 21 equipped, then it's worth switching even if the item level is less than plus 15. Now as far as legendaries go, not much has changed, although the ones that were always viable seem to be closer together when it comes to viability, so you can basically pick 2 out of these 5 and you'll be fine. And that's of course the Drape of Shame, Valen's Sight, Prida's Soul of the High Lord, Jewel of Silvermoon, Marad's Dying Breath and Obsidian Shoulders. Any of these offer great advantages, and which one you use highly depends on the situation you find yourself in and the playstyle you wish to have, as some of them change the gameplay drastically. And finally, the trinkets to pursue are, well, only one, and that's the Argus legendary one, or the normal one. So, really, there is no other trinket in this raid that suits the Holy Paladin in any single way. That's why the other trinket you should be equipping is the Sea Star if you have a high item level from Heroic or Mythic. So if it's Titan Forged, basically. Otherwise, there isn't much difference between the rest of the trinkets, as they are all shit for us, basically. So in an ideal situation, you would have the Argus trinket and the Sea Star, but if you aren't that lucky, well, don't focus on trinkets that much. Now let's talk talents. The usual Legion build, which I'm calling it, is of course this one. That's the outline of the build. The thing is, since we have 5 viable legendaries, this tree may look really different depending on which ones you are using. Also, since some of the spells have gone through rebalancing and Antorus bosses require different tactics, you can change basically any of these, but let me elaborate a bit on the two builds. The Legion build assumes you want to ignore the tier 21 force set and its proc, and basically treat it like a passive healing increase. That way you can continue to play as you've played so far throughout Legion. And the Antorus build focuses entirely on the force set bonus. That build looks something like this. Now, before I get ahead of myself, let's take it slow and go tier by tier. Bestow Faith can still potentially have the highest HPS, but it's no longer a mandatory pick. Both other options are really viable in both builds. So if you want to preserve some mana, Crusader's Might is great for that. It also is very good to offset a second Holy Paladin. As you might have known, throughout Legion, 2 Holy Paladins were a really bad idea in a raiding group, but going for Crusader's Might provides the raid a much different healing pattern than a usual Paladin does. So having 2 isn't a big issue anymore if you pick this talent. And Light's Hammer, of course, has been buffed in a previous patch, so it's a viable option in many raid fights that require stacking. So really all 3 have their uses, and what is even better, all 3 can be used in most situations with similar results. Now, with the increase in our gear, the Aura tier has tilted to sacrifice more than ever, but the other 2 options have their uses as well. You just have to look for them. Another thing to consider in this tier is that it has 3 distinct type of players in mind. The selfless and virtuous Paladin will take devotion as a default, while the HPS monster will go for sacrifice most of the time, and the new player or a player that likes passives will go for mercy, as it requires the least amount of micromanagement. And of course, a really good player will consider all of them on a boss per boss basis. Continuing these sentiments, Divine Purpose and Holy Avenger also define the type of player you are. Divine Purpose provides really fun gameplay, but it also is very random, and that's not so good for any healer. So it's not reliable in tricky situations. While Holy Avenger is a really dependable ability that ties into our cooldown rotation perfectly. So basically it's again up to you which one of these you pick. As for the next tier, even though Judgment of Light is ahead HPS wise compared to Sanctified Wrath can make you into a powerhouse healer in a similar way Aura of Sacrifice does. So if you don't want to min-max a lot, both can be viable. And even in the last tier, there are 2 really good options in Fate and Lightbringer, and a third less used but really effective option in certain situations, which is Virtue. If you think of the dogs on Mythic in Antorus, you can use Virtue to great effect, since you are in a group of 10 people on one dog, and it's always been a good spell to use in a group of that size. So as you can see, my whole point with the talents is most of them are viable, that is if you are going the traditional route. For something new, you have to settle for less freedom. Here comes the fun part. With 100% increase in the healing of your crits from the force set bonus, you get an insane boost to healing. As I said though, the method of getting this buff is unreliable. The way to skew things in your favor is to make Holy Shock your priority cast and give it every advantage you can. That means going for Crusader's Might and using Crusader Strike for most of your free global cooldowns. That means when you don't have to heal much. It also means you have to go for Divine Purpose and Sanctified Wrath. The gameplay that results from these talents and gear is something to behold. Now, I've played with it for a while, and it's really fun to play with. You have to make sure to be close to the boss though, in order to shorten the cooldown of Holy Shock, and you have to time your global cooldowns right, as you will struggle sometimes, if not most times, to fit everything in. It's worth it though. You could also make a weak hours to track the buff you get from the 4 set, but honestly it procs most of the time you need it to, so it's your prerogative. What also goes really well with this build is the Soul of the High Lord and the Legendary Cape. Soul, of course, because Divine Purpose is mandatory for this build, and the Legendary Cape because you will be using Light of Dawn a lot, as it also benefits from Crusader's Might and Divine Purpose. That's what I mean when I say you will be struggling for global cooldowns. And that's also why this is a niche build, sort of, because it requires a fast response time, fast fingers, and always keeps you on your toes thinking of what ability to use next, as it's not always apparent, as the generic Holy Paladin gameplay is. And that's why it can be really strong in the right hands. All in all, not much has changed outside of how the natural progression of gear has affected our gameplay, but anyway, I encourage you to try this build out. It can be lots of fun, and hell, try to discover other builds. There are a lot of possibilities and a lot of time to spend in Antorus before BFA comes around. That's about all. What I'll be doing next is I want to talk about my experience in Legion overall and kind of formulate my thoughts on it. I also wanted to do a video going through each boss in Antorus and point out the best way to play as a Holy Paladin in those fights, but it's maybe a bit too late for that, and the guild I'm currently in is kinda struggling in Mythic, so I'll see how it goes. But what I can do, if anyone is interested, is I can do that for Heroic. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you next time.